The mountain mist hangs low over the highlands today, thick and suffocating, as if trying to hide a secret that the earth itself is ashamed to hold. James stands amidst the towering stacks of mahogany, his black-rimmed glasses slightly fogged by the damp air, his silhouette appearing like a fallen king reclaiming a throne made of bark and sap. He isn't merely counting logs, he is counting the futures of 74 families. Each piece of timber represents a pillar of hope, a Lunar New Year bonus that marks the difference between a cold, hungry winter and a warm hearth for the workers who have followed him into these woods. His mind still sharp with the cold instincts of a man who once ruled global boardrooms, flickers with the language of numbers, 50 tons ready for shipment, an 830 million VND target, and a razor-thin margin for error. This woodyard is no longer just a business to him. It is his sanctuary of penance, a place where the physical pain of labor is the only currency that can buy back his soul from the sins of his billionaire past. James runs a calloused hand over the rough, damp surface of a massive log, the grit of the highlands settling deep into his skin. He remembers the feel of silk contracts, but the friction of this mahogany feels more real, more honest. Diep steps out from the shadows of the rugged wooden shack, her white lotus collar shirt a stark, pure contrast to the oil-stained timber and the gray, unyielding sky. She watches him for a moment, noticing the way he grips his ledger, his knuckles white against the paper, his breath coming in shallow, ragged clouds. "James, your hands are trembling, and you haven't stopped coughing since the fire went out at dawn," she whispers, her voice filled with a soulful sorrow that mirrors the heavy atmosphere of the valley. She reaches out with a white cloth, gently wiping the grease and sweat from his forehead. Her touch is the only warmth in this frozen landscape, a tender mercy for a man who has forgotten how to forgive himself. "Please, drink this ginger tea, James," she urges, pressing the warm ceramic into his dirt-stained palms. "The woodyard can wait, but your lungs cannot handle this dampness." James takes a sip, the heat of the tea a small relief against the biting wind. He looks at Diep, his eyes softening behind the cracked lenses of his glasses. "If we ship these 50 tons by Friday, Diep, the workers will have their 9 million VND bonus each," he says, his CEO mind calculating the logistics even as he shivers. "They've worked too hard to go home empty-handed. I won't let them down." For a fleeting moment, there is a fragile bliss between them, a man and a woman building a world out of sawdust, sweat, and simple love. But the reviewer knows, and perhaps James feels it too, that this peace is merely an illusion, a candle flickering stubbornly in a storm that has already begun to howl across the mountain peaks. The silence of the highlands is suddenly broken not by thunder, but by a sound far more terrifying. A rhythmic, metallic clicking deep within the iron belly of the main planer machine. James freezes, his jaw clenches, his eyes narrowing as he listens to the symphony of his life's work turning into a funeral dirge. It is an omen, a subtle vibration that tells him the shadow of the empire he thought he escaped. The ruthless kingdom of his father, Mr. Hoan, has finally found the back door to his sanctuary. He rushes to the Iron Beast, the machine that was supposed to process the 50 tons of hope, and tears back the casing with desperate strength. Thick black oil splashes onto his white shirt, soaking into the fabric like a dark stain of guilt. But he doesn't care. His fingers touch the jagged, razor-sharp edge of the main spindle. It didn't wear out from age or friction. It was cut, a surgical, cold-blooded strike of sabotage meant to cripple him. The 50 tons of wood are now dead weight, a monument to a father's merciless message. Diep stands behind him, the cup of tea falling from her hands, shattering on the rough wooden planks into 1,000 jagged pieces. The terror in her wide, tear-filled eyes tells the whole story. They were so close to the holiday deadline. so close to proving that a king in exile could provide for his people without the billionaire's blood money. Underneath the broken motor, amidst the pool of oil, James finds a small, yellow slip of paper. It isn't a bill, it is a receipt for a debt his mother, Mrs. Huyen, thought she had buried decades ago, a debt paid in betrayal. The betrayal isn't just mechanical, it is generational, a poison passed down from a father who believes his son is nothing more than another asset to be owned. Mr. Huyen isn't just trying to break a machine, he is trying to break James's spirit by showing him that every ton of wood he cuts is already property of the empire. James picks up a rusted iron bar from the floor, his grip so intense that his arm muscles tremble visibly under his oil-stained sleeves. He looks at the ruin of his dream, the 50 tons of wood that now feel like a tombstone for his pride. Then he turns to Diep. The exhaustion in his face is gone, replaced by a dangerous, sacrificial fire. "They think they can bury us under this timber, Diep." His voice is a low, guttural rumble, vibrating with a vow that echoes through the serrated wooden porch of their shack. "My father gave me life, but he does not own my soul, and he does not own our home. I will fix this axis with my bare hands if I have to, and I will ship every single ounce of this wood before the first light of the holiday." As the hard-side sunlight cuts across his scarred, oily face, the Highlands King accepts the war he never wanted. He turns back to the darkness of the machine, ready to fight for the only sanctuary that ever truly loved him back, knowing that the price of protection may be more than he can ever pay. The night in the Highlands doesn't just fall, it descends like a heavy indigo curtain, cold enough to crack the bones of the unprepared. Inside the wood yard, the only light comes from a single flickering bulb and the dying embers of a fire that Diep has struggled to keep alive. James is a shadow among iron, his black glasses pushed up onto his forehead, his face a map of grease, sweat, and a growing dangerous resolve. He has been working for 4 hours straight on the broken axis, his fingers bleeding from the jagged edges of the iron. Each turn of the wrench is a silent prayer. Each drop of black oil on his white shirt, a baptism into the world of the common man. He isn't just fixing a machine, he is fighting for the promise he made to the 74 families who rely on him. A promise of an 830 million VND Lunar New Year bonus that now seems like a fading dream. Diep watches him from the doorway of the shack, her white collar now stained with soot, her eyes reflecting the soul-deep sorrow of a woman who fears the wind more than the cold. She approaches him softly, carrying a bowl of hot rice and a cup of medicinal tea. She doesn't ask him to stop anymore. She knows the king must finish his penance. "James, your hands are shaking and the wound on your palm is opening again. Please stop for just a moment to eat. You cannot fix the machine if you break yourself," she whispers, her voice a fragile anchor in the mechanical darkness. James stops, his chest heaving, his CEO mind calculating the minutes remaining until dawn. If this axis doesn't spin by sunrise, Diep, these 50 tons of mahogany are nothing but expensive firewood. I told the workers 9 million VND each, and I will not be the man who lies to them, he murmurs, the brief mention of numbers, the only remnant of his corporate past. Suddenly, a second shadow joins them in the yard. Mrs. Huyen steps into the dim light, her face a mask of hidden scars and protective instinct. She sees the yellow slip of paper that James found under the motor, now clutched in his oil-stained hand. As the reviewer must warn you, the presence of the mother is rarely a harbinger of peace in this valley. Mrs. Huyen reaches out, her fingers trembling as she touches the paper. "James, you shouldn't have found this. This isn't just a receipt for a machine part. It's the original debt from your father's woodworking factory 20 years ago," she says, her voice cracking like dry timber. The revelation turns the night air into lead. The betrayal isn't just a mechanical sabotage, It is a generational trap set by Mr. Huan to reclaim the son who dared to leave the empire. Diep gasps, the bowl of rice in her hand slipping and shattering against the rough wooden planks, echoing the Part 1 destruction of her hope. Mrs. Huyen looks at Diep with a sorrow that suggests she knows more about Diep's mother, Dieu, than she has ever dared to speak. Your father and Mr. Huan, they weren't just partners, James. They were rivals for a woman's heart and a king's fortune. This broken machine is my husband's way of saying that the debt must be paid in blood or surrender, Mrs. Huyen whispers, her eyes darting toward the distant road. The threat escalates as a pair of headlights cut through the mountain mist like the eyes of a stalking vulture. Mr. Han's luxury black car idles at the edge of their sanctuary, a silent, armored beast representing the crushing weight of a billionaire's wrath. Little Nai wakes up from the noise and steps onto the serrated porch, her small hands rubbing her eyes. Uncle James, why is the big car here again? I'm scared, she whimpers, her voice pulling James back from the brink of total darkness. This is the final hook, the point where the fallen king must choose his path. Mr. Huan does not step out of the car, but a messenger approaches with a single white envelope, the final ultimatum. The chairman says the 50 tons are already his. Sign the return contract, and Diep and Nai will never hunger again. Refuse, and the law will take this land by sunrise. James looks at the iron bar in his hand, then at the pure, terrified face of Nai, and finally at Diep, the woman who traded her youth to wait for him. James sets his jaw in a grim, sacrificial line. He doesn't take the envelope. Instead, he lifts the rusted iron bar and strikes the machine casing, not in anger, but in a vow of absolute defiance. Tell my father that he can keep his empire of blood and contracts, James says, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrates through the very timber of their home. I am no longer the man who hides behind a desk. I will fix this axis with my own sweat, and I will protect this woman and this child until my own heart stops beating. As the luxury car turns away, leaving them in a silence heavier than the mist, Diep approaches James. She doesn't speak. She only places her trembling hand on his oily shoulder, a silent protector for a king who has finally found his true crown. But as the dawn begins to gray the sky, the true secret of Mrs. Huyen's fear remains, a secret that could burn their sanctuary to the ground before the first light of the new year.
Giữa áp lực Tết cận kề, James dốc sức cứu xưởng gỗ, nguồn sống của 74 gia đình, nhưng phát hiện trục máy bị phá hoại có chủ đích, kéo theo sự thật về món nợ cũ giữa cha anh và quá khứ đẫm toan tính. Lá phiếu nợ mà mẹ Huyền từng chôn giấu nay trở thành đòn tâm lý, chứng minh đế chế của ông Hoang chưa từng buông tha. Khi xe sang xuất hiện cùng tối hậu thư đòi ký hợp đồng trả lại 50 tấn gỗ để đổi lấy an toàn cho Diệp và bé Nhi, Giang đứng trước lựa chọn sinh tử, cúi đầu để bảo vệ người thân hay giữ lời hứa với công nhân bằng chính đôi tay rỉ máu. Anh từ chối thỏa hiệp, thề sửa máy và giao hàng đúng hạn, chấp nhận bước vào cuộc chiến công khai với quá khứ và quyền lực của cha mình.